Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I've been trying to make sense of what happened that weekend for the past 3 months. My hands are shaking even as I type this, but I need to get it out. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar or can help me understand what we went through. I've barely slept since then, and the few friends who were there with me, well, we don't really talk anymore. How could we? None of us can explain what happened at that cabin. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. My friend Rachel found this place on some rental site, a cabin near Thompson Lake, about 4 hours from the city. The photos looked amazing. 3 bedrooms, a huge deck overlooking the lake, complete privacy. The price was surprisingly reasonable for what we were getting, especially split between the 5 of us. Looking back, maybe that should have been our first warning sign. Our group had been friends since college: Rachel, Mike, Sarah, Dave, and me. We're all in our late 20s now, caught up in our careers, barely seeing each other anymore. This trip was meant to help us reconnect, you know? No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just us hanging out like old times. God, I wish we'd just gone to a bar instead. We arrived around 4 p.m. on Friday. The drive up was normal enough, though the last 7 miles were on this narrow dirt road that seemed to wind endlessly through dense forest. The cabin itself looked exactly like the photos, a big 2-story log structure with that deck I mentioned. The rental company had left the key in a lockbox by the door, and everything seemed fine at first. The weird stuff started almost immediately, but it was subtle. Like, we all kept checking our phones even though we knew there wasn't any service. Normal habit, right? But every time I looked at my phone, the time seemed off. I'd check it, put it away, and when I pulled it out again a few minutes later, sometimes an hour had passed. I figured my phone was just glitching because of the poor reception. We got settled in, unpacked our stuff, and started drinking around 6 p.m. The sun was setting and we were all on the deck catching up. That's when Sarah noticed something odd about the dust on the living room window. From the deck you could see these weird marks, like someone had written something. We went inside to look closer, and I still get chills thinking about what we saw. Written in the dust were words: Day 6, time wrong, help. The writing was shaky, like whoever wrote it was terrified. We tried to laugh it off, probably just the last renters playing a joke, right? Dave even made some crack about it being a marketing ploy, like those fake ghost stories tourist spots use to attract visitors. But then we heard the first noise from inside the walls. It wasn't like rodents or anything normal like that. It sounded like whispering, but muffled, like someone was talking through dense insulation. We all heard it. This wasn't just one person being paranoid. Mike, always the rational one, suggested it might be the pipes or the wind. We wanted to believe him. We decided to distract ourselves by making dinner. Rachel and I were in the kitchen cooking pasta while the others set up board games in the living room. That's when things started getting really messed up with time. I remember putting the pasta in the water, and Rachel went to the bathroom. I swear she was only gone for maybe 2 minutes, but when she came back, the pasta was completely overcooked, like it had been boiling for an hour. The water was almost completely evaporated. How long was I gone? Rachel asked, looking confused. Like 2 minutes, I said. But when I checked my phone, it showed 8:47 p.m. We'd started cooking at 7:15 p.m. We called the others in to eat, trying to act normal, but everyone was on edge. The whispers from the walls had gotten more frequent, and now they almost sounded like words, though none of us could quite make them out. We were all speaking a little too loudly, laughing a little too hard at jokes that weren't funny, trying to cover up the sounds. After dinner, we tried to play Monopoly, but that's when the time distortions became impossible to ignore. Dave would take his turn, and by the time it got back to him, he'd swear only seconds had passed, but the rest of us had experienced several full rounds of play. Sarah started crying when she realized her watch showed a different time than everyone else's phones, and all of our devices disagreed with the old analog clock on the cabin wall. Then we found the journal. Mike discovered it wedged between the couch cushions while looking for a dropped dice. It was just a basic spiral notebook, but the entries inside, I can barely think about them without having a panic attack. The first entry was dated 2 weeks before our stay. First night at the cabin. Beautiful place. Just need to unwind and get some writing done. The next entry was dated the same day. Something's wrong with time. Phone says 3 hours passed, but sunset hasn't moved. Called rental company, but phone doesn't work. The entries got more frantic, more scattered. Some were dated the same day, some days apart, but they were clearly written by someone losing their grip on reality. The last entry just repeated, "The walls know when it is," over and over for 3 pages. We should have left right then. We all knew it, but here's the thing. When Dave went to get the car keys, they weren't where he left them. We turned the place upside down looking for them. While searching, Sarah found another message written in dust on a bedroom mirror. "Cars don't leave anymore." That's when the power went out. In the sudden darkness, the whispers from the walls got louder. We could almost understand them now. Almost, but not quite. Like they were in a language that was almost English, but distorted somehow. We huddled together in the living room, using our phones as flashlights, watching the battery percentages drop at impossible speeds. Mike suggested we try to walk out, but Rachel reminded us it was 7 miles to the main road through dense forest. We'd never make it in the dark. So we waited. The next few hours were the longest of my life, but also somehow the shortest. We'd experienced these periods where we'd blink and suddenly our positions in the room had changed, like we'd moved without being aware of it. The whispers got clearer. They were talking about time, about loops, about being trapped. Sometimes we'd hear footsteps upstairs when all 5 of us were clearly in the living room. Around what our phones said was midnight, though it was still twilight outside, which was impossible for that time of year. We found more writing appearing in the dust on the windows. Not old messages, new ones forming as we watched. They said things like, "You're in it now," and "Time is food." Sarah had some kind of breakdown around then. She started screaming about how she could see herself sitting in different parts of the room, like multiple versions of her were occupying the same space. When we looked where she was pointing, we could almost see it too, like shadow versions of ourselves, slightly out of sync. The worst part came when Mike's phone somehow called his own number, and he answered it. We could all hear his own voice on the other end, telling him to get out before the loops start, but it was speaking from some point in time we couldn't understand. After that, Mike's phone screen just showed random times and dates, flicking through them like a slot machine. What happened next is hard to explain. The whispers in the walls turned into screams, but they were our screams, like the walls were playing back things we hadn't done yet. The room seemed to stretch and compress, and I swear I could see previous versions of us playing Monopoly, eating dinner, finding the journal, all happening simultaneously. Dave started talking about how he remembered the next 3 hours perfectly, even though they hadn't happened yet. Rachel was crying, saying she could feel time moving backwards through her body. I experienced the same dinner conversation 7 times in what felt like both seconds and years. Then, as suddenly as it all began, it stopped. We found ourselves standing in the driveway next to our car at 9 a.m. Saturday morning. The keys were in the ignition. All of our phones showed the correct time, all synchronized. The cabin looked exactly like it had when we arrived. No dust messages, no journal. We got in the car and drove home in complete silence. Here's the thing that still haunts me. According to every clock and calendar, we only spent 1 night at the cabin. But I have memories of days, weeks, maybe even months in that place. We all do. Rachel says she remembers growing old and dying there multiple times. Mike swears he lived an entire lifetime in what our phones say was just 17 hours. I tried calling the rental company when I got home. The number doesn't work anymore. When I look for the listing online, I can't find it. I tried to find the cabin again 2 weeks ago, drove up there with my brother. The dirt road was there, but it just ended in dense forest after about a mile. No cabin, no lake. Nothing. The only proof I have that any of this happened is a single photo on my phone. It shows all 5 of us standing on the deck, smiling, taken right after we arrived. But if you look at the window behind us, you can see something written in the dust. It's backwards in the reflection, but when I flip the image, it clearly says, "Welcome back." I still can't sleep most nights. Every time I close my eyes, I hear those whispers from the walls. Sometimes I wake up and catch myself writing messages in the dust on my windows, but I can never remember doing it. The others report similar experiences. Sarah moved to another state. Dave quit his job and now works nights, so he never has to experience sunset. Mike seems okay on the surface, but his girlfriend told me he's become obsessed with clocks. He has dozens of them in his apartment now, all showing different times. And Rachel sent me a text last week that just said, "I can still feel the loops." When I called her about it, she had no memory of sending it. But her phone showed it was sent at exactly the same time as when we first pulled up to that cabin 3 months ago. I don't know what happened to us that weekend. I don't know if time is really what we think it is. All I know is that somewhere, in some version of time, we're still there, writing messages in the dust, trying to warn ourselves. And sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear whispers coming from my walls, speaking in my own voice, telling me that time isn't a line, it's a loop, and we're all still caught in it. I never wanted to buy a house near the old Millbrook station. The price was just too good to pass up, especially with today's market. My realtor was surprisingly upfront about why it was so cheap. Nobody wanted to live near an abandoned train station that had such a dark history. But I figured, hey, what's the worst that could happen? It's just a decrepit building with some rusty tracks. That's what I kept telling myself. Now, 4 months later, I'm writing this from a hotel 50 miles away, and I still can't shake the feeling that I made a terrible mistake moving there. It started about 2 months after I moved in. At first, everything was normal, almost peaceful, really. The house needed work, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. The old station was visible from my kitchen window, about a quarter mile down the hill. During the day, it was just part of the landscape, a sad, crumbling reminder of better times. But something changed that first night I heard the whistle. I was doing dishes around 11:30 p.m. when I heard it. Faint but distinct. A train whistle, but different somehow. It sounded hollow, if that makes any sense. Like when you blow across the top of an empty bottle. I remember dropping the plate I was washing because it startled me so badly. I knew there hadn't been trains running on those tracks for decades. Not since the accident in '89. For those who don't know about it, I sure didn't before moving here. There was a horrible derailment in 1989. Train 242 was making its regular midnight run when something went wrong with the tracks. The official report blamed rail deterioration, but locals say there was more to it. 17 people died that night, including all the staff. They say some bodies were never recovered from the ravine. After hearing that whistle, I started noticing other things. The worst was the lights. They would appear around midnight, like clockwork. Not bright lights, more like the weak glow of old-fashioned lanterns moving slowly along the tracks. The first time I saw them, I thought kids were messing around down there. Called the police and everything. They came out, searched the whole area, found nothing. No footprints, no signs of trespassing. The officer looked at me like I was crazy when I insisted I'd seen lights. I started keeping a log after that. The lights would appear most nights between 11:45 p.m. and midnight. Sometimes they'd flicker for just a few minutes, other times they'd last for hours. The whistle became more frequent too. And then I started hearing voices. Not clear conversations, but the murmur of what sounded like dozens of people talking at once carried on the wind. I know I should have just moved out then. Any sane person would have. But I'd sunk all my savings into this place, and honestly, I became obsessed with figuring out what was happening. I started researching everything I could about the accident, about the station's history. I found old photographs of passengers who died that night. Their faces haunted me, normal people heading home to visit family, to job interviews. None of them knew they'd never reach their destination. Last week, I finally worked up the courage to walk down to the station at night. I know, stupid decision, but I had to know. I grabbed my flashlight, phone, and a jacket. It was weirdly cold for June, and headed down around 11:30 p.m. The station looked different at night. During the day, it's just a shell, broken windows, crumbling brick, rusty metal. But that night, I swear it looked almost maintained. Not new, but not completely abandoned either. The lights I'd seen from my house were clearer now, old-style lanterns hanging from posts along the platform, swaying slightly, though there wasn't any wind. As I got closer, the whispers I'd been hearing became clearer. I could make out fragments of conversations. Running late again. Should have arrived by now. Need to make the connection. Normal things you'd hear at any train station, except there was something wrong with the voices. They had this echo to them, like they were coming from the bottom of a well. That's when I saw them. At first, they looked like regular people standing on the platform, maybe 24 of them. Some were sitting on benches, others standing with suitcases at their feet. But as I got closer, I realized I could see through them. Not completely, they weren't like movie ghosts or anything, they were more like old photographs that had started to fade, showing the brick wall behind them. I recognized some of them from the accident photos I'd researched. There was the young woman in the blue dress who'd been heading to her sister's wedding. The old man with the pocket watch who never made it to his grandson's graduation. The businessman who left behind 3 kids. They all looked so normal, so patient, like any group of people waiting for a late train. I should have run. Everything in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. But I was frozen, watching this impossible scene unfold. Then one of them noticed me. A middle-aged woman in clothes that looked straight out of the 80s. She turned and smiled, and I'll never forget what she said. "Oh, good. Another passenger. We've been waiting for so long. Train's running a bit late tonight, but it should be here soon." Others started turning toward me then. Their faces were kind, welcoming, like they were genuinely happy to have company in their endless wait. That's what made it so terrifying. They didn't seem to know they were dead, or maybe they did and just didn't care. They started moving toward me, asking if I had a ticket, telling me not to worry. The train would be here any minute now. I backed away, but they kept coming closer. The air got colder and colder until I could see my breath. The whistle sounded again, closer this time, and I swear I could hear the rumble of approaching tracks. The ghost passengers got more excited, gathering their spectral belongings, moving toward the platform edge. One of them, the businessman, reached out to grab my arm, probably to help me board when the train arrived. His hand passed right through me, but I felt it, like plunging my arm into a bucket of ice water. That's when I ran. I don't remember much about the trip back to my house, just that I was sobbing and stumbling the whole way. When I got home, I threw some clothes in a bag and drove to this hotel. Haven't been back since. Here's the thing that keeps me up at night. I've been reading more about that accident. Over the years, several people have gone missing near that station. They were written off as runaways or accidents, but now I wonder, were they like me? Curious observers who got too close? Did they join those eternal passengers, waiting forever for a train that will never actually arrive? I'm putting my house on the market. I don't care if I take a loss. But I felt like I needed to write this down to warn others. If you're ever near Millbrook Station late at night and you hear a whistle or see lights on the abandoned platform, don't investigate. Don't let your curiosity get the better of you. Those passengers are still waiting, and I think they're lonely. They want company for their eternal wait, and they don't seem too picky about how they get it. Sometimes at night, even here in this hotel room, I swear I can still hear that whistle in the distance, and part of me wants to answer it, to go back, to wait with them. There's something almost peaceful about their endless patience, their unshakable faith that their train will finally arrive. But I know if I go back, I might never leave again. The hardest part is knowing that somewhere deep down, a small part of me wouldn't mind that at all. I still get chills every time I think about that night. My wife Sarah and I had just moved into our new house in a quiet suburb of Boston about 6 months ago, and we were excited to finally host our first dinner party. It was supposed to be a simple gathering, Just a few close friends, good food, and wine. But what happened that evening in October changed everything. The weather had been unusually cold for early fall, and there was this weird fog that had settled over our neighborhood all day. I remember standing in our kitchen around 6 p.m., helping Sarah with the final preparations. She was taking the lasagna out of the oven when our doorbell rang. It was strange because none of our guests were supposed to arrive for another hour. When I opened the front door, I found myself face to face with a tall, thin man wearing a dark pea coat. He had this genuine smile that somehow made me uneasy. Before I could say anything, he exclaimed, "Mike, God, it's been forever," and stepped forward like he was going to hug me. I awkwardly stepped back, trying to place his face. He looked to be around my age, maybe mid-30s, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. His clothes seemed slightly outdated, like they were from the early 2000s, and his skin had this weird pallor to it. "I'm sorry, but I'm drawing a blank here," I admitted, trying to be polite. "Have we met before?" He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, Mike. It's Daniel, from Harrison High. We were lab partners in Mr. Peterson's chemistry class. Remember the time we accidentally set fire to the classroom?" That's when my stomach dropped. I did have a lab partner named Daniel in high school who I'd gotten into trouble with, but this couldn't be him. The Daniel I knew had died in a car accident during our senior year. Before I could process this, Sarah appeared behind me. "Who's at the door, honey?" The man, Daniel, immediately turned his attention to her. "You must be Sarah. Mike's told me so much about you." The thing is, I hadn't told anyone anything about this guy. I hadn't thought about Daniel from high school in years. Maybe it was the shock, or maybe it was that ingrained Midwestern politeness I could never shake. But somehow we ended up inviting him in. Sarah, always the gracious host, offered him a glass of wine. I watched in a daze as he made himself comfortable in our living room, acting like he belonged there. Over the next hour, as we waited for our actual guests to arrive, Daniel told stories about our supposed shared past. He knew details about my high school years that were eerily accurate. The name of my first girlfriend, the time I broke my arm playing football, even the exact shade of blue my old Volkswagen had been painted. But something felt wrong about the way he told these stories. It was like he was reciting facts from a book rather than sharing memories. Then he started telling darker stories. He talked about a series of accidents that had happened at our high school, incidents I'd never heard of, but he described them with such vivid detail that I found myself getting more and more uncomfortable. He mentioned students who had gone missing, teachers who had died under mysterious circumstances, all while maintaining that pleasant smile that never quite reached his eyes. Sarah kept shooting me worried glances. We'd been together for 8 years, and she knew everything about my past. She knew I'd never mentioned these incidents before. Around 7:30, I got a series of texts from our friends. Every single one of them had some sort of emergency come up. Flat tires, sick kids, work obligations. It was like the universe was conspiring to leave us alone with Daniel. That's when things started getting weird. The temperature in our house began to drop dramatically. I could see my breath in the air even though our heating system was running full blast. The lights in the kitchen started flickering, and our cat, usually the most social creature, was nowhere to be seen. Daniel seemed completely unfazed by all of this. He just kept talking, his stories getting darker and more disturbing. He started describing accidents that hadn't happened yet. A gas explosion at the local grocery store, a multiple-car pileup on the highway, a house fire 2 streets over. The way he described these future events made my skin crawl. Sarah excused herself to go to the bathroom, and I followed her into the hallway. "We need to get him out of here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Something's not right." When we returned to the living room, Daniel was standing by our fireplace looking at our wedding photos. But in the reflection of the glass, I swear I saw something else. Something that wasn't human. When he turned around, his face looked different for a split second, like a mask that had slipped slightly out of place. "You know, Mike," he said, his voice suddenly deeper. "I've been meaning to ask you something. Do you remember what really happened that night in the chemistry lab?" I felt my blood run cold. The official story was that we'd accidentally mixed the wrong chemicals, but I'd never told anyone the truth, that Daniel had deliberately caused the explosion, laughing as the flames spread. It was something I'd tried to forget for years. The lights in our house began to flicker more intensely. The temperature dropped even further. Objects on our shelves started vibrating, and we could hear a low humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight. Daniel's smile grew wider, too wide for a human face. "It's almost midnight," he said, checking a watch that looked like it had stopped working years ago. "Time really flies when you're catching up with old friends, doesn't it?" That's when our cat suddenly appeared, hissing and arching its back. It was staring at something behind Daniel, something we couldn't see. The mirrors in our house began to fog up, and when I looked at them, I could see writing appearing in the condensation. He never left the lab. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The real Daniel hadn't died in a car accident. That was just the story they'd told everyone. He'd died in that chemistry lab fire, and I'd been the only witness. I'd lied about what happened, and somehow, someway, he'd come back. As the clock on our mantle started chiming midnight, Daniel's face began to change. His skin seemed to melt away, revealing charred flesh underneath. The smell of burning chemicals filled the air. "You know, Mike," he said, his voice now completely inhuman, "I've been waiting 18 years to finish our last experiment." Sarah screamed. I grabbed her hand and ran for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. Behind us, we could hear Daniel laughing, that same horrible laugh from the chemistry lab. The lights in our house exploded one by one, showering us with sparks. Just as the last chime of midnight faded, everything stopped. The temperature returned to normal. The doors unlocked, and when we turned around, Daniel was gone. The only evidence that he'd been there at all was a single burn mark on our coffee table, in the exact shape of a chemical burn from our high school days. We called the police, but what could we tell them? That we'd been visited by the ghost of my dead lab partner? That he'd come back to remind me of the guilt I'd been carrying for 18 years? They'd think we were crazy. We ended up moving out of that house a month later. We couldn't stand being there anymore, knowing what had happened. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I can smell burning chemicals. Sarah says she occasionally sees a tall figure standing in our yard, wearing an outdated pea coat. But the worst part? Last week, I read in the news about a gas explosion at our old local grocery store, exactly like Daniel had described. I'm terrified to think about what else he predicted might come true. I've never told this story to anyone before. Part of me is still trying to convince myself it was all just a bad dream. But I know what I saw that night. And I know that somewhere out there, Daniel is still waiting, ready to finish what we started in that chemistry lab all those years ago. I've been sitting on this story for months now, trying to make sense of what happened. I still get chills thinking about it. Even as I type this, my hands are shaking. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. Last August, me and 4 of my closest friends, Mike, Sarah, Josh, and Rachel, decided to go camping in the Blackwood Forest, not its real name for privacy reasons. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, looking to disconnect from our phones and just enjoy nature for a few days. We're all experienced campers, having done similar trips before, but nothing could have prepared us for what happened that night. We arrived at the campsite around 2 p.m. It was a beautiful day. Sunny, not too hot, perfect camping weather. The site was pretty remote, about a 4-hour drive from the city, and then another 2-mile hike from the nearest parking area. We wanted somewhere quiet, away from the usual tourist spots. Looking back, maybe that wasn't the smartest choice. Everything was normal at first. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and spent the afternoon hiking and taking pictures of the scenery. The forest was dense with huge old-growth trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The kind of trees that make you feel small, you know? There was this thick carpet of pine needles everywhere that muffled our footsteps. It was peaceful, but something felt off. I can't explain it, but it was like that feeling you get when you think someone's watching you. Around sunset, we started making dinner. Josh had brought his portable grill, and we were cooking burgers when Sarah mentioned how quiet it was. That's when I realized there were no bird sounds, no crickets, nothing. Just complete silence. We brushed it off, figuring the animals were just scared of our fire or something. The sun went down, and we were sitting around the campfire telling stories, having a few beers. It must have been around 10 p.m. when Rachel suddenly stopped mid-sentence and asked, "Did you guys hear that?" We all went quiet. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then, there it was, a whisper. So faint I thought I was imagining it. It sounded like it was coming from the trees behind my tent, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. "It's probably just the wind," Mike said, but there wasn't any wind. The air was completely still. The whispers continued, getting slightly louder. They weren't in any language I could understand, but they had this urgent quality to them, like someone trying to tell you something important but not wanting to be overheard. Josh laughed and stood up. "Okay, very funny. Which one of you set up speakers in the woods?" He walked toward the tree line with his flashlight, but the moment he got close, the whispers stopped. We were all pretty freaked out by then, but tried to play it cool. Sarah suggested we turn in for the night, thinking maybe we were just tired and our minds were playing tricks on us. I wish we'd just packed up and left right then. I couldn't sleep. The whispers started again around midnight, but different this time. They were clearer, more distinct. It sounded like multiple voices overlapping, all trying to say something at once. The weird thing was, they seemed to be getting closer to our campsite. That's when I heard Mike unzip his tent. "Guys," he called out, "I'm going to check the perimeter real quick. This is getting weird." "Don't go alone," I said, quickly putting on my shoes. But by the time I got out of my tent, he was already at the edge of our campsite, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Mike, come back," Sarah hissed. She was out of her tent too now, along with Rachel and Josh. Mike turned back toward us, his flashlight illuminating the concerned looks on our faces. "I'm fine. It's probably just some kids trying to..." The whispers suddenly got louder, much louder. They were coming from everywhere now, surrounding us. And they weren't just whispers anymore. They were urgent, almost panicked, like dozens of voices trying to warn us about something. "Behind you!" Rachel screamed. Mike spun around, but his flashlight beam caught nothing but trees. Then we heard it, a sound I'll never forget, like something between a growl and the creaking of old wood, but wrong. Just fundamentally wrong in a way I can't describe. Mike's flashlight flickered once, twice, then went out completely. "Mike?" Josh called out. "Mike, get back here now." No response. Sarah's flashlight beam joined mine as we desperately tried to see where Mike was. But he was gone. Completely gone. There 1 second, vanished the next. The only sound was those damn whispers growing more frantic by the second. Rachel was hyperventilating. "We need to find him. We need to find him right now." "Mike!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by that terrible growling sound again, closer this time. We had no choice. We grabbed our flashlights and phones, no signal of course, and headed into the woods. The whispers started again, but they were different now. They seemed to be guiding us, growing louder when we went one way, quieter when we went another. It was terrifying, but it was the only lead we had. Our flashlight beams caught something strange on the trees as we walked. Marks that looked like claw marks, but huge, and they seemed to be glowing. Not reflecting our lights, but actually giving off a faint, sickly green luminescence. The whispers led us to a clearing we hadn't seen during our hike earlier. The trees here were different, older, twisted in unnatural ways. The ground was bare, no pine needles, no vegetation, just dark earth that looked almost black in our flashlight beams. In the center of the clearing was an old stone well. It wasn't on any of our maps, and it looked ancient. The stones were covered in symbols I'd never seen before, and they were glowing with the same greenish light as the claw marks. The whispers were almost deafening now, and they were coming from the well. Rachel started crying. Sarah was muttering, "This isn't real. This isn't real." over and over. Josh was just frozen, staring at the well. That's when we saw it. I still have trouble describing what it was. It was like someone took all your worst nightmares and twisted them together into something that shouldn't exist. It rose from the well, this mass of darkness that seemed to absorb our flashlight beams. It had eyes, so many eyes, all glowing with that same sickly green light. And it had Mike. He was suspended in the air, unconscious, or I couldn't tell. The thing held him with what looked like tendrils of pure darkness. The whispers reached a crescendo, and suddenly I could understand them. Run! 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 We ran. God help me. We ran and left Mike behind. The thing made that horrible sound again, and we could hear it pursuing us through the trees. The whispers were all around us, guiding us back to our campsite. I could feel the cold radiating from whatever was chasing us, feel its hunger. We burst into our campsite, and the whispers suddenly changed. Light, light, light. Josh understood first. He dove for his backpack and pulled out the emergency flare he always carried. The thing was at the edge of our campsite now, its countless eyes fixed on us, Mike still in its grasp. Josh fired the flare directly at it. The flash of red light was blinding. The thing made a sound that I felt more than heard, like reality itself was screaming. Through my squinted eyes, I saw Mike fall to the ground as the creature recoiled from the light. Sarah and Rachel ran to Mike while Josh fired another flare. The thing retreated into the darkness, those horrible eyes disappearing one by one. The whispers faded to nothing. The forest was silent again. Mike was alive, but unconscious. When he came to a few minutes later, he had no memory of what happened after his flashlight went out. We packed up our stuff in record time and got the hell out of there, half carrying Mike back to our cars. We reported what happened to the park rangers, but they found nothing. No claw marks, no signs of anything unusual. They probably thought we were drunk or high. Mike recovered physically, but he's different now. He can't stand being in the dark, and sometimes I catch him staring at nothing, listening intently. The rest of us have nightmares. Sarah moved to the city, saying she needed to be around people and lights. Rachel and Josh broke up. They couldn't handle how the experience changed them both. I've researched for months trying to find any similar stories, any explanation for what we encountered. The closest I've found are some old local legends about an ancient entity that feeds on fear, that was trapped in a well by indigenous people centuries ago. But the details are vague, and I can't verify any of it. The whispers still haunt me. Were they trying to warn us? Save us? Or were they part of that thing's trap? I don't know. All I know is that something is out there in those woods. Something that shouldn't exist, and sometimes late at night when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear them whispering. I haven't been camping since. None of us have. Some things you just can't explain, and some experiences change you forever. If you're planning a camping trip in any remote forests, please be careful. And if you hear whispers in the trees, run. I've been trying to make sense of what happened that day for months now. Even typing this makes my hands shake, but I need to get this out. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar and can help me understand. This happened back in March when I went hiking with my friends at Blackwood State Forest. I'm a pretty experienced hiker, and I've done lots of trails in the area, but I'd never been to the old fire watchtower before. It's kind of off the main trails and technically not part of the official park routes anymore. I'd heard stories about it, like everyone else around here, about Ranger Sullivan who vanished in '97 while working there. The official story was that he got lost in a snowstorm, but his body was never found. That morning started normally enough. There were 5 of us, me, my roommate Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, and our friends Mike and Chris. We'd been planning this hike for weeks, waiting for good weather. It was one of those perfect early spring days, around 60 degrees. Barely any clouds. We got to the trailhead around 9 a.m. The path to the tower isn't marked anymore, but Mike had downloaded the coordinates. The first hour was just regular hiking, nothing weird. We were all in pretty good spirits, joking around, taking pictures of the early spring wildflowers. The trail got steeper and narrower as we went up, and that's when things started feeling off. It was subtle at first. The birds stopped singing. I know that sounds like a cliche, but it's true. One minute the forest was alive with sound, and the next it was dead quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Sarah noticed it first and mentioned something felt wrong. I brushed it off, told her it was probably just the elevation change affecting the wildlife. About 2 hours in, we got our first glimpse of the tower through the trees. It was taller than I expected, maybe 80 feet high, this skeletal steel structure rising above the tree line. The weird thing was how pristine it looked for something abandoned. No rust, no graffiti, just this perfectly preserved tower that looked like it could still be in use today. As we got closer, Chris swears he heard someone whistling. Not like a bird, like a person whistling a tune. We all stopped to listen, but it was gone. That's when Jake said maybe we should turn back, but we'd come so far already. Classic horror movie mistake, right? But we weren't in a movie. This was real life, and real life doesn't work like that. At least that's what I kept telling myself. The base of the tower had this small concrete building attached to it, probably where the ranger would stay during their shifts. The door was locked, but through the dirty windows we could see it was still furnished. Old desk, chair, some filing cabinets. It looked like someone just walked away one day and never came back. Which I guess is exactly what happened. The tower stairs were steel mesh, the kind you can see through to the ground below. They seemed solid enough, so we started climbing. That's when the first real warning came. It wasn't subtle anymore. It was a clear, loud voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Leave. Now. We all froze. Mike laughed nervously and said it had to be someone playing a prank, maybe other hikers. But we hadn't seen another person all day, and the voice, it didn't sound quite human. It had this strange echo to it, like it was coming through an old radio with bad reception. Sarah wanted to go back down, but we were already more than halfway up. The voice came again, louder this time. This is your last warning. We should have listened. God, we should have listened. When we reached the observation deck at the top, the door was unlocked. Inside, the room was a perfect circle with windows all around, giving a 360-degree view of the forest. But we barely noticed the view, because what we saw inside made our blood run cold. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them. They were all of the same man, who I recognized as Ranger Sullivan from the old news articles. But these weren't normal photos. In each one, he was standing in this same room, but in each picture, he looked progressively more wrong. In the first ones, he looked normal, smiling at the camera. But as you went around the room, his appearance changed. His skin got paler, his eyes darker. In the last photos, he barely looked human anymore. In the center of the room was a small table with what looked like an old logbook. The last entry was dated the day Sullivan disappeared. The writing was frantic, barely legible. It won't let me leave. It keeps changing the stairs. God help me. The tower is alive. That's when the door slammed shut behind us. Chris grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. We all tried, but it was like it had been welded shut. Then the whole tower started to vibrate, a low humming sound that we could feel in our bones. The windows began to fog up, but not from the outside. It looked like something black was seeping through the glass. The temperature dropped so fast we could see our breath. Sarah started crying, and I'm not ashamed to admit I was close to it myself. The photos on the wall started changing. I swear to God the images were moving like those Harry Potter pictures, but this wasn't magical or fun. It was terrifying. Sullivan's face in every photo turned to look at us, his eyes completely black now, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Mike tried to break one of the windows with a chair we found in the corner, but the glass wouldn't even crack. The humming got louder, and now we could hear what sounded like footsteps coming up the stairs. Slow, heavy footsteps that no human could make. The logbook on the table started flipping its pages by itself, faster and faster, and then just exploded into a shower of paper. The sheets flew around the room like they were caught in a windstorm, even though there was no wind. And on every page, written over and over in different handwriting, was the same message. The tower chooses who stays. I don't know how long we were trapped up there. Our phones had no signal and they all died at the same time, even though they'd been fully charged that morning. The footsteps kept getting closer, and we could hear this awful scraping sound like metal being dragged across metal. We huddled together in the center of the room as far from the doors and windows as we could get. The temperature kept dropping until we could barely feel our fingers. The humming had become so loud it was hard to think, and the black substance seeping through the windows was starting to take shape. Long, dark tendrils that reached toward us. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The humming cut off. The temperature rose and the door swung open with a quiet click. We didn't wait around to see what would happen next. We ran down those stairs so fast I'm amazed none of us fell. But here's the thing that still haunts me. The stairs were different going down. I know that sounds impossible, but I swear there were more of them, and they seemed to twist in ways that didn't make sense. Several times I looked down and saw that we were somehow higher up than we'd been a moment before, even though we'd been descending the whole time. When we finally reached the bottom, the sun was setting. According to our phones, which were working again, we'd been up there for over 6 hours, but it had felt like maybe 1 hour at most. We ran back to our car without stopping, without looking back. Later, we tried to make sense of what happened. We looked up everything we could find about the tower and Ranger Sullivan. We found old newspapers that talked about strange events at the tower going back to the 1950s. 3 other people had disappeared there before Sullivan, all in similar circumstances. They went up to the tower alone and were never seen again. We reported what happened to the park rangers, but they just said the tower had been demolished years ago. When we insisted and offered to show them, they humored us and followed us back there. But where the tower had been, there was nothing but an empty clearing. No foundation, no concrete building, nothing to suggest anything had ever been built there. I've been back 3 times since then, trying to find some evidence of what we experienced. The tower is never there, but sometimes when I stand in that clearing, I can hear that humming. And once, just once, I heard that voice again whispering, "The tower is waiting." The others won't talk about it anymore. Sarah and Jake broke up a month later. Mike moved to another state. Chris blocked all our numbers and social media. I guess we all cope differently, but I know what we saw. I know what we experienced. And I know that somewhere out there, that tower still exists, waiting for the next group of hikers who don't heed its warnings. I still have nightmares about those photos, about Sullivan's face turning to watch us. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear that humming in my walls. But what really terrifies me is the thought that maybe the tower let us go for a reason. Maybe it wasn't finished with us. Maybe it's just waiting for the right moment to call us back. If you're ever hiking in Blackwood State Forest and you come across an old fire watch tower that's not on any of the maps, please just turn around and leave. Some places aren't meant to be explored. Some mysteries should remain unsolved. Because sometimes when you go looking for answers, you find out that you're not the one asking the questions. You're just another part of something sick game. I don't know why I'm sharing this now. Maybe as a warning, maybe just to finally get it out of my system. But I know one thing for certain. That tower is still out there, and it's not just a building. It's something else. Something that doesn't belong in our world. And sometimes, late at night, I can feel it calling to me, trying to draw me back, and the worst part is, part of me wants to answer that call, to go back, and finally understand what really happened that day. But the rest of me knows that if I do, I might end up like Ranger Sullivan. Just another photo on that wall, another story for people to whisper about, another mystery that will never be solved. I need to get this off my chest. What happened to my family last summer at Blackwood National Park still haunts me every single night. I've spent months trying to make sense of it, but I can't. Maybe writing about it will help, I don't know. I just need someone to hear this. My wife Sarah and I had been planning this camping trip for months. Our kids, Emma, 12, and Lily, 6, were finally old enough to handle a proper wilderness adventure. We're experienced campers. Well, Sarah and I are. But nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered in those woods. We arrived at Blackwood on a Tuesday morning in late July. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot. The park ranger at the entrance station seemed a bit odd when we told him where we planned to camp, in the northern section near Bear Creek. He hesitated, then suggested we try the more popular southern campgrounds instead. But I'd done my research. The northern area was more secluded, more wild. That's what we wanted. Looking back now, I wish I'd listened to him. The hike to our camping spot took about 3 hours. Emma complained the whole way, typical preteen, while Lily bounced around collecting leaves and rocks full of energy. We found a perfect clearing near a small stream. Flat ground, sheltered by tall pines, water nearby. It was while scouting the perimeter that I first saw it. Maybe 50 yards from our campsite, partially hidden by undergrowth, was a circle of stones. Not just random rocks. These were clearly placed deliberately. Each stone was about waist high, weathered and covered in moss. There were 12 of them arranged in a perfect circle, maybe 20 feet across. In the center was a flat stone that looked almost like an altar. I'm a history buff, so this immediately caught my interest. It didn't look Native American. The stones were too uniformly sized and placed too precisely. I called Sarah over to look. She was fascinated too, and even took some photos. The kids were less impressed. Emma rolled her eyes when I started theorizing about its origins, and Lily just wanted to use the stones for her fairy house. We set up camp, had dinner, hot dogs and s'mores, camping classics, and settled in for the night. That's when things started getting weird. I woke up around 2 a.m. to what sounded like singing. Not regular singing. This was more like chanting in a language I didn't recognize. It was faint, barely audible, but definitely there. I unzipped the tent and peered out. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in a pale blue light. The stone circle was just visible through the trees, and there was movement there. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was seeing things. Dark shapes seemed to be moving around the stones, weaving between them in some kind of pattern. But when I looked directly at them, they seemed to fade into the shadows. The chanting continued, rising and falling like waves. I woke Sarah, but by the time she got up, the sounds had stopped. She thought I was just hearing things, maybe wind in the trees or some kind of bird. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. We went back to sleep. The next day was normal enough. We hiked, fished in the stream, caught nothing, and the kids played around camp. But I kept feeling like we were being watched. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck? I had it all day. Every time I looked at the stone circle, something felt wrong. The air around it seemed different somehow, like it was slightly distorted, the way air looks above hot pavement. That night we all heard it. The chanting started earlier, around midnight. Sarah grabbed her phone to record it, but the battery was dead, even though she'd charged it fully that morning. Emma was terrified, clutching her sleeping bag. Only Lily seemed unaffected. She sat up in her sleeping bag, head tilted, listening intently. "They're calling me," she said in a weird, flat voice that didn't sound like her at all. That sent chills down my spine. I held her close, and she snapped out of it, seeming confused. The chanting got louder, and now we could definitely see figures moving around the stones. They were tall, impossibly tall, their movements jerky and unnatural. The shadows they cast in the moonlight were wrong somehow. They moved independently of the figures, writhing like snakes. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but Sarah pointed out it was too dangerous to hike out in the dark. We had to wait until morning. None of us slept much that night. When dawn came, we started packing immediately. But Lily was acting strange. She kept staring at the stone circle, mumbling under her breath. When I tried to get her to help pack, she threw a massive tantrum, completely unlike her usual sweet self. Then it happened. Sarah and I were taking down the tent while Emma sorted our supplies. Lily was sitting nearby, still sulking. I looked away for maybe 30 seconds. When I looked back, she was gone. The panic that followed is still a blur. We searched the immediate area, screaming her name. Nothing. Then Emma pointed toward the stone circle. There were footprints in the dew-covered grass, small footprints, Lily's size, leading straight to it. When we reached the circle, the air felt wrong, heavy, like before a thunderstorm, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The stones seemed to be humming, a low frequency you could feel in your bones more than hear. And there, in the center, on that altar-like stone, was Lily's stuffed rabbit, the one she never went anywhere without. Sarah started to step into the circle, but I grabbed her arm. Something told me that would be very, very bad. As we stood there, paralyzed with fear, the humming got louder. The shadows around the stones began to move, even though it was broad daylight. They stretched and twisted, taking shapes that shouldn't be possible. Then we heard Lily giggle. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Her voice, but with something else underneath it, something ancient and wrong. The shadows were moving faster now, and in them I could almost see faces, if you could call them faces. They had too many eyes, too many mouths. Emma screamed. The sound snapped me out of my paralysis. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran into the circle, straight to the center stone. The air felt like molasses, and the humming was so loud it made my teeth hurt. The shadows reached for me with what looked like hands, but I forced myself to ignore them. I grabbed Lily's rabbit and held it up. "Give her back," I screamed. Not very original, I know, but I wasn't exactly thinking clearly. The humming stopped. Everything stopped. The silence was absolute, the kind you never hear in nature. Then Lily's voice again, but normal this time. "Daddy?" She was standing just outside the circle, looking confused. Sarah and Emma ran to her while I stumbled out of the circle, my legs shaking so bad I could barely walk. Lily had no memory of what happened. She thought she'd just gone to pick flowers. But she was covered in a fine gray dust that sparkled in the sunlight, and there were strange symbols drawn on her arms, not with ink or paint, but raised like scars. They faded over the next few hours, but I got photos first. We got out of there as fast as we could. The ranger didn't seem surprised when we showed up at the station, wild-eyed and terrified. He just nodded sadly and said something about the old ones being restless lately. When I pressed him for more information, he clammed up. I've researched those stones extensively since then. I found a few vague references in old books about similar circles in the area, and stories about children going missing. Some turned up days or weeks later with no memory of where they'd been. Others were never found. The symbols on Lily's arms? I found those too, in a book of ancient Celtic runes. They spelled out words in a language that died thousands of years ago. When I finally found someone who could translate them, I almost wished I hadn't. They said, "She is marked. They will return." Lily seems fine now, mostly. But sometimes I catch her staring into space, mumbling in a language that sounds like the chanting we heard. And on full moon nights, she draws pictures, always of 12 tall figures standing in a circle. We're moving soon, as far from Blackwood as we can get. I don't know if it will help. Those things, whatever they were, found us once. What's to stop them from finding us again? If you're ever hiking in Blackwood and come across a circle of stones, do yourself a favor. Turn around and get out of there. Some places aren't meant for humans. Some things should be left alone. I learned that the hard way. I just hope they don't come back for her. I never thought I'd share this story, but I need to get it off my chest. It's been 3 months since everything happened, and I still can't sleep properly. Every time I close my eyes, I see that painting, and my hands shake just typing this out. I'm an art collector. Nothing fancy, just someone who enjoys finding unique pieces at estate sales and small auctions. That's how I found the painting that would turn my life upside down. It was at this estate sale in a Victorian house just outside of Boston. The previous owner had passed away and her children were selling everything. The painting caught my eye immediately. It wasn't particularly large, maybe 24-36 inches, but something about it just pulled me in. It showed a peaceful countryside scene, rolling hills, an old oak tree, and a small cottage in the distance. The colors were stunning, deep greens and rich earth tones with this incredibly realistic fog rolling in from the corners. The asking price was ridiculously low, just $75. The seller, an elderly man who introduced himself as the deceased woman's brother, seemed eager to get rid of it. Looking back, I should have noticed how his hands trembled when he handed me the painting, or how he wouldn't look directly at it. But I was too excited about my find. The artist's signature was barely visible in the bottom corner, EM 1962, and the style reminded me of the Hudson River School, though something about it felt more intimate. I hung it in my bedroom that same evening, opposite my bed. That's when things started getting weird. The first night I had this dream that I was standing in the exact landscape from the painting. It felt so real. I could feel the damp grass under my feet, smell the earthy scent of approaching rain. But there was this overwhelming sensation of being watched. Not just watched, studied. Like something was memorizing every detail of my face, every movement I made. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The painting looked different in the morning light. I could have sworn the fog had spread further across the canvas, obscuring more of the cottage. I took photos to compare, thinking I was just being paranoid. I wish I hadn't lost my phone a week later. Those pictures would have proved I wasn't going crazy. The dreams continued every night, becoming more intense. In each one, I could walk further into the landscape. The cottage got closer, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting between trees, a figure in the cottage window. But whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. What really started freaking me out was how the painting seemed to change depending on my mood. After a particularly rough day at work, when my boss criticized my presentation, I came home to find the sky in the painting had darkened, with threatening storm clouds gathering above the cottage. When I got news that my sister was expecting her first child, the next morning the oak tree was covered in spring blossoms, in what was clearly an autumn scene the day before. I tried to research the artist, but EM gave me nothing concrete to go on. That's when I started having flashbacks to something I'd buried deep in my memory. When I was 12, I had an imaginary friend named Emma. She was an artist too, and I used to spend hours watching her paint in my mind. My parents sent me to therapy because I became too invested in this friendship, refusing to accept she wasn't real. Eventually, I forced myself to forget about Emma. But here's the thing that makes my blood run cold. The landscape in the painting? It's identical to the place where Emma and I used to meet in my imagination. Every single detail matches my childhood memories perfectly. The dreams kept getting more intense. One night, I woke up in the dream to find myself inside the cottage. The walls were covered in hundreds of paintings, all showing different moments from my life. My first day of school, my high school graduation, my father's funeral, everything. And in each painting, if you looked carefully, there was a figure in the background watching me. Always watching. In the center of the room stood an easel with a blank canvas. Next to it was a woman, her back turned to me. She was wearing clothes from the 1960s, her gray hair tied in a neat bun. When she turned around, I recognized her immediately. It was Emma, but aged, real. She smiled at me, but it wasn't the warm smile I remembered from my childhood. This smile was hungry, desperate. "You abandoned me," she said, "but now I've found you again. And this time, I'll make sure we stay together forever." I woke up screaming, my room freezing cold despite it being a warm September night. The painting had changed completely. The peaceful landscape was gone, replaced by the interior of the cottage. And there we were, Emma and I, frozen in that moment, her hand reaching out toward me. I ripped the painting off the wall and drove to my sister's house at 3 a.m. When I told her everything, she helped me look up the previous owner of the house where I'd bought the painting. What we found made me physically sick. Elizabeth Morrison, a local artist, had died in 1962. She was found in her studio, surrounded by hundreds of paintings of the same young girl in different situations. The girl was never identified, but Looking at the old newspaper photographs, I recognized myself in every single painting. The article mentioned that Morrison had no children of her own and had suffered from severe mental illness in her later years, claiming she could connect with people through her paintings, that she could share their lives through her art. She died while working on her final painting, a self-portrait in a cottage studio. I burned the painting that night in my sister's backyard. As it went up in flames, I swear I could hear a woman screaming, and for a split second, I saw Emma's face in the smoke, her features twisted in rage. The dream stopped after that, but sometimes, when I'm about to fall asleep, I feel that familiar sensation of being watched. And every now and then, I notice small changes in photographs around my house. A shadow where there wasn't one before, or a figure in the background that looks disturbingly familiar. I still can't explain what happened. Was Emma real? Was she Elizabeth Morrison's spirit somehow connected to my childhood imagination? Or am I just losing my mind? All I know is that I haven't bought any more paintings since then, and I've covered every mirror in my house. Because sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of an elderly woman standing behind my reflection, holding a paintbrush, smiling that hungry smile. I try to tell myself it's just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know Emma is still out there, still watching, still painting my life from the shadows. And I can't help but wonder, in how many other paintings is she trapped, waiting for someone else to bring her back into the world?